All right, hello everybody. Welcome to week 8. This week we're going to kind of move on from specific types of terrorism and talk about some responses to radicalization and terrorism. There's 3 articles this week: Carter and Carter, Newman, and Pearl. Each one takes a little bit of a different approach to the topic. I'm going to spend most of the time talking about Carter and Carter and Newman, and then just hit on Pearl just a little bit. So first, Carter and Carter. This article discusses the use of law enforcement intelligence in combating terrorism. One way that they do that is through intelligence-led policing. Now, obviously, intelligence-led policing is not strictly a counterterrorism type of strategy. It's a traditional law enforcement type strategy, but it's used quite a bit. It's pretty effective at mitigating some of the risk from terrorism. So intelligence-led policing relies on the analysis of raw information, which then guides the decision-making process. So while the exact way that different agencies go about that process varies somewhat, but there's basically 6 steps to the intelligence cycle at the heart of the entire process: planning and direction, collection, processing and collation, analysis, dissemination, and reevaluation. So that's the process through which law enforcement agencies assess and analyze raw information, whether it's terrorist or otherwise. Now, there's a good figure in the article that shows the process in action. All right, so another way law enforcement attempts to mitigate the risk from terrorism is through suspicious activity reporting, or SAR reports. Now, this is a formal process where they document and share behaviors that may indicate criminal behavior or terrorist behavior in this case. So there's 3 different types. The financial SAR, which is used to report certain types of transactions to the Treasury Department. There's a second one called the All Crime SAR, and this is used to document and report suspicious activity. And then the third type is Information Sharing Environment SAR. This SAR specifically is used to report suspicious activity related to terrorism. It's very similar to the All Crimes, but the process it goes through after it's reported is different, and it's shared more widely than the All Crimes. Another important part of the law enforcement response to terrorism is through developing partnerships. Now, whether they're using intelligence-led policing or suspicious activity reports or some combination of both, public and private partnerships are extremely important. Of course, this is nothing new. Since the advent of community policing, the importance of these community partnerships has been a focal point for law enforcement officers and law enforcement agencies. So the article then concludes with a couple of case studies and discussions of implications. Be sure to read the case studies and think about the implications identified by Carter and Carter. And then think about, did they miss anything? Are there other implications that maybe they didn't come up with? All right, so the second article is by Newman. And this article discusses radicalization. So what radicalization is and how it occurs has been a point of contention among academics and practitioners for many years. So Newman discusses some of these problems with radicalization. As you're reading this, think about what this means for practitioners, policymakers. As you remember, earlier in the semester, we discussed some of the problems with defining terrorism. Well, here we are again. Okay, what's radicalization? There's no consensus on what radicalization means or what it is. And there's 2 main kind of areas of contention, when you're talking about radicalization process. The first is, the 2 of them are there, the endpoints of radicalization, and then issues surrounding context and normative issues related to it. So pretty generally, almost everybody pretty much agrees that radicalization is a process. People pretty much agree that nobody just wakes up one day and with all of a sudden they have these radical views and when they didn't have them the day before. It's pretty well agreed upon that it's this process that people go through. But where people start arguing about is over kind of the extremism part of the definition of radicalization. What is extremism? What is extreme? Are these ideas that we're discussing? Is this how people try to achieve their aims? What are we getting into when we start talking about extremism? So if radicalization is the process of someone becoming an extremist or a terrorist, then what's the end? Is this simply having the ideas, or does it require some action at some point? So you'll see the different viewpoints and different beliefs in these definitions. When you look at the ones that are adopted, there's several of them listed there in the article, and you'll see how the different approaches vary based on whether we're talking about ideas or whether we're talking about behaviors. So another question then is, what is the relationship between ideas and actions? Are these separate phenomenon, or are they related so closely that you discuss them together, or is it somewhere in between? Okay, so that kind of leads us into this discussion then about context and normative issues. Just like terrorist means different things for different people in different places, radical also has that similar effect. The use of the word radical, or radical behavior, radical ideas. So something like the time period would depend on how that's viewed. Something that was considered to be radical at one time may not be radical at another time. The article lists Martin Luther King Jr., and that's a great example. Martin Luther King Jr. was considered a radical in the 1960s. Is he considered a radical now? Most people would, say no, right? Martin Luther King Jr. was not a radical. But in the 1960s, he was considered a radical by a lot of people. Think about the United States context here. The founding fathers would have been considered radicals, probably even terrorists, to the British. Do we consider them that? Have we, do the American people consider the founding fathers to be terrorists? Probably not, right? But if you ask the British at the time, absolutely. Throwing tea in the harbor, and all the things that they were doing, they probably would consider them to be terrorists. So when you start assigning the word or the term radical or something like that to someone or a set of beliefs, it's oftentimes met with skepticism because it is so context-driven that it's, a lot of times you end up in the big debates about whether something is actually radical or not. Okay, so the article then goes on to discuss some more about this relationship between radicalization, radical beliefs, radical actions. So it's important to remember the overwhelming majority of people, and it's overwhelming, it's not even close. People that hold quote-unquote radical beliefs or extreme beliefs never manifest those beliefs into action. Most people that have these extreme beliefs don't ever do anything about it. Now, they may run their mouth, they may do whatever, but they don't actually ever physically do anything. They never acted out in any kind of violence. So what is it then that makes one person become violent that almost everybody else doesn't? Okay, so that's kind of the big crux here when we talk about radicalization, is what's kind of the tipping point? What about the process? So you can't really assign just a radicalization process if you have different outcomes based on different people. So that's where a lot of this argumentation about, what is radical, what is not, what's the process, it all kind of stems from that. So it goes on to talk more about some of these academic articles, or arguments about, we're talking about cognitive radicalization versus behavioral radicalization, which is worse, which is more important. But it's important, make sure you read that. I don't have time to go into all of it in this video, because these videos have to be, probably 15 minutes or less. But think about the kind of background, because it goes right into this next discussion we're going to have about political arguments about it. So politically, at least in the West, there's two kind of main approaches, we'll call them, to countering radicalization. There's the Anglo-Saxon approach, and then there's the European approach. So the Anglo-Saxon approach deals with behavioral radicalization, specifically acts of terrorism and violence. It doesn't worry about cognitive radicalization at all. So the threshold for government intervention under the Anglo-Saxon approach is intention to break the law, not whether what you believe or what you believe about somebody. None of that matters. Okay, it's all about acts. It's all about intention to break the law or breaking the law. Obviously, this is the approach to the United States. Freedom of speech and the right to believe whatever someone wants to believe, as long as they don't infringe on the rights of others. Under the Anglo-Saxon approach, that's none of the government's business. Okay, as long as the people are peaceful, as long as they don't hurt anybody else, as long as they don't infringe on other people's beliefs, don't matter. Right? It's all about actions. So the main goal under this view is to stop people from breaking the law, and therefore law enforcement is responsible for counterterrorism and extremism. The European approach attempts to address both cognitive and behavioral radicalization, but places more emphasis on cognitive radicalization. So under this view, not only is the link between ideas and actions definite, the beliefs themselves are the problem and are potentially dangerous. And so this approach makes more sense if you're thinking about the European context, because Europe is all rooted in the upheaval suffered at the hands of extremists in Europe in the early 20th century. So when you think about those two views, there's obviously trade-offs with each of those approaches. And there's good points to both and probably bad points to both. So I'm not going to get into all that too deeply here, but read about those and think about these trade-offs that are associated with those approaches, and then what are the implications for each view. So if you decide to use the European approach, what are the implications of that for policy? If you use the Anglo-Saxon approach, what are the implications for policy then? All right, so the final article then is by Pearl, and the focus of this report is how do you measure success with counterterrorism measures? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it makes some really good important points when considering counterterrorism strategies. How do you know if something's successful? If you're talking about counterterrorism apology, what is success? Is it no attacks? Is it a limited number of attacks? Is it number of casualties? I mean, how do you decide what makes something a success when you're talking about counterterrorism measures or policy? How do you quantify that? Okay, what criteria are you going to use, to define success? Okay, how do you choose those criteria? Is there selection bias involved in that, and is that a problem when you try to decide what you're using to measure success? Okay, so think about all those things as you're reading Pearl, but that's a real issue. We have all these counterterrorism measures that we use. We have these policies in place. We have all these things that we're doing. How do you know if you're being successful at that? Okay, and how do we measure that? So say you're a policy maker and say you work for DHS and you design a new course of action. How do you know if that's successful or not? How are you going to measure that? How are you going to justify what you're doing based on some measure of success? Okay, so think about those things as you're reading Pearl, because it really is important, not only just for terrorism, but criminal justice in general. We have these policy measures that we do. How do you decide if something's successful or not? All right, I'm going to stop here. Be sure to complete the assignments for this week. I'll see you next week. And as always, if there's questions, please don't hesitate to let me know.